Hey guys, it's me, Wolf, back with a short and quick update video on the Windmill. I quote-unquote finished it in the latest Stronghold Crusader Builds video, but there is one moment that I just couldn't get out of my head. What I wanna say is, when it is active, you can see inside. I didn't know that. If I had known that, I would have built it like that. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do in this video. I just couldn't get myself to start building the bakery before completely finishing the windmill and being happy with how it looks. Also, this might be a shorter video, but these changes actually took longer than I've expected again. But let's look at the inside of the windmill in-game again and compare it to my version. The first difference is the position of the millstone. I placed it on the ground floor and here it is on the first floor. The shape is also very different. Here in game it seems like the round millstone is surrounded by a wooden border, fortified with a metal ring. It kinda looks like a wider open barrel, and I think inside here are the two millstones on top of each other. My version is, well, not that nice. The cogwheels used in the mechanism are also very different from mine. Here the vertical axis, powered by the sails, is turning a wheel on the back that has the teeth sticking out perpendicular. The teeth are not directly on the shaft. I'm 12. And the lower wheel is completely different from mine, and on my version the wheels are in the second floor, and in game there is no second floor. One tiny detail I speculated about in the first video was how to access this part. And with the upper part being open like this, we can see that there's a door on the back side here. So we can say that there are quite some differences, and I would like to try and get as close as possible to the in-game building. So let's start with the Symphony of Destruction. After these atrocities, I started with making the first cogwheel. I thought it would be better to use a harder wood for this one, so I saw the slab of this piece of walnut, I'm not really sure, but it's hard. And a little tip here, these Japanese saws are not really suitable for our Western hardwoods. I had to find that out the hard way. After cutting off this slab, I used a compass to make one circle where I have to cut and the second one for the teeth radius. I measured out the teeth spacing, which is 30 degrees. That means that we are left with 12 positions, just like on an analog clock. I punched the holes and drilled a 3mm hole on every mark and a 2mm hole in the center. I drilled this center hole because I wanted to nail the wheel onto a piece of scrap wood to then be able to turn it around while cutting with my bandsaw. After that I can drill the middle hole open for the vertical axis. I used a 15mm Forstner bit, and to prevent tear out I drilled a little bit on both sides first and then went all the way through. I also prepared the round pieces for the lower cogwheel with the same process, and if you're looking at the small window in-game here, we can see that the teeth on this wheel are flat and not round. So I marked where the teeth should go, clamped the two wheels together in my vise and started to cut out these spaces. Here are the two finished parts. The bottom one has, just like the bigger wheel, a hole in the center for the main axis shaft that powers the millstone. I used this little piece of wood as a template to cut the teeth of the cogwheels to the correct size. The bigger wheel gets round teeth, so I made some sticks with the same method I used in the windmill video and cut them to 15mm, and the lower one gets thin strips as teeth, so I cut them on my bandsaw and cut them to 20mm. With the teeth and flat parts ready, I started with gluing the round teeth into the bigger wheel, and to line up the smaller wheel I clamped it into the vise with a spacer in between. Glued the strips on there, and I obviously have to leave one space open to remove the spacer. Now if you're looking at the in-game building real quick again, we can see this little pattern on the lower wheel, and I wanted to try and recreate this as well. I glued some thin strips of wood on a piece of paper and let it dry. Then I used my steel wool vinegar stain to give it a weathered look, but I guess I left the vinegar solution rest for too long again and it only got brown, so I still burnt it a little bit with the Bunsen burner and scraped it with a steel brush. I transferred the size of the wheel on there, and these strips were thin enough to cut them out with a normal pair of scissors. I then cut this circle into quarters and started to glue them on the wheel until I realized that this doesn't work. I glued these two pieces on a piece of paper on reverse again and did the burning thing again until I had a nice looking pattern on the top. And that's it for the wheel. Spoiler alert, that's not it, because they really didn't work like that. To fit the bigger wheel inside the building, I had to modify the roof part a little bit. I filed the lower beam round, placed the spacer in here and added another round piece on top. I also added this flat slice of wood in here because there was a gap in the roof, and to have the right dimension to finish most of the gluing like this and later glue it back onto the windmill again, I glued the roof on this thin frame. For the roof part in the front I had a quicker solution. I omitted the spacer and instead of filing these round pieces, I've placed this cross piece in here to then drill a hole in both pieces. I got some tear out while drilling here, but it's on the inside, so whatever. With that ready, I thought that now's a good time to glue the bigger wheel onto the vertical axis, and at first I wasn't really sure how to fasten it on there. Maybe super glue would have been enough, but I wanted to make sure that the wheel wouldn't get loose and turn around. My solution for that was to make another smaller round piece where I drilled the hole inside, and to prevent that one from turning around the shaft, I glued a nail inside there. Now I have more glue surface area for the bigger wheel and a face that's perpendicular to the shaft. At that moment I've also realized that the lower wheel I made was way too big, and if we're looking at the in-game building again, we can see that the proportions from lower wheel to the entire room are also off, and that means I have to remake this one later on. But let's finish the bigger wheel first. I made another round piece like this to prevent the shaft from going back and forth, cut the shaft to size and drilled the holes for the sails. Before placing it inside the mill, I carved out the rough wheel size on here to get it a little further back, and I also shortened the teeth a little to create more space for the lower wheel. To let it slide better, I used my beeswax linseed oil combo and rubbed some on the back. Then I glued the front of the roof back on there and closed all the open spaces with wooden boards, and now we have one functioning cogwheel. Back to the lower wheel. This is the second version with a smaller top and bottom piece, and they are also only half as thick as the one before. By the way, using the Forstner bit on a piece that thin was scary, but it worked out, and the teeth are also thinner and shorter, and I went from 12 to 6 teeth. My intention here was to have the millstone shaft to go through the lower part of the wheel and glue it on the top here. I did that, I've tried it, and it didn't work. The gear ratio was off, the spacing between the teeth was too tight, and the teeth of the upper wheel were hitting the shaft in the middle. I've tried the spacing out before and it worked just fine like that, but I gotta find a different solution. Because the gear ratio and spacing was wrong, I decided to cut off every second tooth on the bigger wheel. It's kinda ugly now, but maybe it works better. And together with that step came version number 3 of the lower wheel. It's pretty similar, but it only has 5 teeth. That means more space in between, and I used another one of these round pieces with a nail going through to glue the wheel onto the shaft. And the most obvious change here is that I've added the new millstone. For that one I drew a circle on a relatively flat stone, and I don't know a whole lot about stone hardness, but this one was significantly harder than the one I used before, so I already had a hard time drilling the 5mm hole, so I've decided to just leave it like that. I used a diamond cutting disc for my angle grinder to cut it round, and because I didn't want to drill another hole, I thought that I could make 2 millstones out of this one by cutting it in half. That was pretty risky because the stone is already relatively thin, but it worked pretty well. And that's it for the lower wheel and the millstones. For now. Let's jump over to the border of the millstones real quick. I started off with the metal rings, and for those I cut some thin strips, then hammered and sanded the surface to make it look a little older and more used, and then I cut some sticks to size. Laid them on some metal and burnt them to make them look old. I then glued the metal strips on a piece of paper to make them hold still, and then glued the strips on there in reverse. After scrubbing the sticks with the wire brush, they looked like this, and to make the border round I used a piece of wood that's just slightly bigger than the millstone. To connect the two metal strips I first glued them together, then drilled the hole inside and used a tiny nail that I hammered round, kinda like a rivet. This is the finished border, and my plan now was to shove a round piece of wood up there as a spacer where the lower millstone is connected to, and then let the upper stone with the wheel on it turn on the lower millstone. I experimented around with this system a little bit and later added these two wooden strips on top to prevent the upper millstone from falling out, and now we should be ready to place this part inside the windmill. Right?
Wrong.
The floor was too high up, I removed the floor, but it still didn't work. And the real problem here wasn't the floor, it was the friction the two millstones, the border around them and these two wooden strips created. If I turn it with my hand it goes really easy, but as soon as I try to push it with a stick it jams up. The next best thing I came up with is this version, where I simply drilled a hole in this thin metal piece that is supposed to hold the wheel up so that it doesn't create friction with the lower millstone. So I added this part on the back of the windmill wall and added these 45-degree pieces to make it look a little nicer. And guess what? It still didn't work. The problem this time was the lower wheel was too light and the upper wheel pulled it up, and with that the millstone and those wooden strips created too much friction again. But I won't give up that easily. My next plan was to use some scrap pieces of stainless steel where I drilled the hole into and hammered a wire into the lowest one. Then instead of super glue I used this very strong 2-component adhesive to glue them together and later glue them onto the millstone. Why did I do that, you ask? Those pieces are supposed to act as a weight to hold the millstone down. On the next day the glue was dry, it's kinda still looking wet, but... Now the grand reveal. Does it actually work? It's a little jumpy, but it kinda works. And with that it's time to add the border around it and put the floor below it. And I did exactly that, but first of all, while I was trying to do that, I broke the lower wheel again and had to remake it. And you can see that the floor is here, but the wooden border is missing again. That's because I had to cut it open. It was too tight and created too much friction again. Friction, again the problem. I wish this project would be a high school physics exercise where the friction can be neglected. But anyways, new version of the border right here. I've added these two shorter metal strips on there and left a piece of wire sticking out here to be able to wrap the border around the millstone and then connect the two pieces later on. This wooden strip here is thicker and longer than the others because I wanted to connect the border to the floor with that one. It obviously broke off during the process, and there's no way I'm cutting the border open again just to add this stick, so I've decided to make this kinda ugly looking border around it. At that point I also made some cuts in the border logs that go around here, because I wanted to keep this removable wall. If we are now looking at the windmill in-game again, we can see that there's a door on the right side of this back wall. And I wanted to add this one as well, but because I left the hole in the floor for the ladder on this side, I put it on the left side. And yes, I totally thought about the ladder and didn't hold the wall on the wrong side when adding the door here. The door itself is nothing special really. I used my self-made hinges and glued some wooden strips wherever I felt like it. Now, because I've replaced the shaft of the upper wheel where the sails are connected to, I had to cut the sails off the existing shaft, and to connect them to the new one, I drilled the hole in the front, glued a piece of wire in there, and because the wood was really thin, I fortified it a little bit with these metal strips. Then I forgot to record how I glued them inside, but nothing really special happened there, so whatever. The windmill is almost restored again, but there is one part that I still have to make, a part that I broke at the beginning, because I wasn't happy with how wobbly the upper part of the building was. This time I cut 4 pieces on my bandsaw and marked everything I wanted to cut off. I was using my small saw again, and something else that I found that I just had to show you is this mini vise. Oh, look at how tiny it is. This is awesome and it works really well too. So away with the old mechanism, clean it up a bit, and this is one of the finished parts that I glued on there like this. Then I went over to the wood lathe and made this little piece that I looped up and then nailed and glued onto a thin piece of plywood. Then I glued this piece of plywood onto the bottom of the windmill, placed the rotating part inside these 3 pieces and closed it in with the 4th. This new rotating mechanism is still a little wobbly, but nowhere near as bad as the first one, and the turning is very smooth as well. We are almost done, so let's begin with adding the smaller details. One little part that's already inside is the ladder from before, just 2 rungs shorter. Another one is the bag of flour, and last but not least is this thing right here. I wasn't entirely sure what exactly that is, so at first I simply made another bag with hay inside representing the wheat. That kinda made sense to me. Wheat is on the upper floor where it is grinded, and the flour falls down onto the floor below. My only problem is that because I've added this not so good looking border, there is no space left on this floor, so I've added it down here. But wait, this time I've checked the in-game footage again, and if we are looking at this little inside view window here, we can see this object a little clearer, and it seems to be a basket. And because I've tried to get most of the details right this time, I obviously had to try and make this basket as well. My initial thought was to make it out of hay that I've glued together with a round wooden piece onto some paper and then weave more hay in between. That worked really well. Because I was so happy about that, I wanted to help myself out with the dark arts and tried to summon a demon with this magic circle. That sadly didn't work out, and with a self-made needle I tried to recreate something that I've learned, I don't know, in preschool or something, with some wool and a round piece of cardboard. It kinda worked, and when I was happy with the size, I put a thin wire around the border and made some knots around it to hold it in place. Then I didn't know what exactly to do with these strings. Should I keep them and weave them in somehow or cut them off? I obviously decided to cut them off, and the result is, well, it's also too big, but hey, at least I've tried, right? Let's cover it up real quick so that nobody sees it. And that's already it for this update video. It got a little longer than I've expected, and I'm not 100% happy how everything turned out. But I mean, we have a windmill that can turn around 360 degrees, that lets us remove the roof to look inside and see how the cogwheels are turning, that lets us open the wall on the back and look inside and see how the millstone is turning. We have a window, a door, a bag of flour, and an ugly basket, but what more could you want in life?
Pussy, money, weed.
No, but for real now, I think this windmill turned out looking pretty good, and as always, thanks for watching.